Hello, and welcome back again to your weekly Sociology of Hip-Hop lecture. In today's lecture, we're going to be moving more towards lyrical analysis of hip-hop music. So while the big picture concepts and the historical context that we talked about over the last two lectures are still relevant, today we're going to be zeroing in on the use of the content analysis method to analyze hip-hop lyrics. The big takeaways from today's lecture should revolve around strategies of kind of picking apart hip-hop lyrics and drawing connections across songs and as well as towards the academic literature, both on hip-hop in general, as we've been covering, but also specifically about issues related to gender in terms of representing women and men, masculinity, femininity, relationships between men and women in a variety of lights, and how those are represented in hip-hop lyrics, and what's the significance of all of these meanings on a big kind of collective scale. So that's what the content analysis method helps us to see and theorize. The first assignment is going to be a kind of mini content analysis, so I will be giving you a lot of directions on how to collect the songs that you'll analyze and to actually complete the analysis, although the arguments and discussion is totally up to you. So as you watch today's lecture and make notes about today's readings, I suggest that you pay extra attention to the analytical strategies that are employed by the authors, because you're going to need to employ similar kinds of strategies to complete assignment 1. So before we go through the assigned readings for today, I just want to say a little bit about the content analysis method and what's expected of you for assignment 1. So on the course syllabus, I say that you'll get practice with sociological research methods and analysis. Though for this course, both assignments are going to be based on a content analysis which you will complete. So since this is a third-year sociology class, I do expect that you have some familiarity with sociological research methods. Throughout this class, we'll be reading research articles where the researchers used, alternatively content analysis, ethnographic research methods, interview methods, and other things like that. Though throughout this course, you will be practicing the content analysis method. So just to kind of summarize what this is, hopefully you do have some familiarity with this from your other sociology courses, especially your social research methods course. But content analysis is exactly what it sounds like. It's analyzing content. So throughout this class, you'll see a lot of examples of this, of analyzing the content, which is hip-hop lyrics. But this can be applied to a variety of things, including, say, images or music videos. So there's 3 general phases of content analysis. Sometimes some projects will only do 2 of these. But for assignment 1, you'll have to do all 3. So the first phase is called open coding. This is generally the exploration phase. So once you've decided your sample of content, so just the range of all the content that you're going to analyze, then you explore it. So that's just basically, if, say, you're doing album reviews, you read them all and just kind of get a general sense of them. If, like in assignment 1, you're doing lyrics, you'll make sure to have all the lyrics, read them through, listen to the songs, get a sense as to what's going on there, what are the messages that are being conveyed, what are the attitudes of the rappers on the track, and just kind of get a general familiarity with the 4 songs that you'll be selecting for the assignment. In that open coding phase 2, you will kind of note things which might stand out to you. For example, there might be derogatory words used a lot, so you might circle all of those and say, okay, well, there's a lot of the use of, say, like the term bitch or something. And you're like, okay, that seems to be something that stands out in this article, so I'm just going to note that. Once you go through all of that, all of the data, you get some sort of familiarity with that content. You move to the counting phase. So this is, like I was saying, like maybe there's a certain term that appears across all of the lyrics, or maybe there's something that's represented. Say you're doing you're coding magazine covers, and you can count, say, how many articles of jewelry are included on this album cover, and then you can compare, say, maybe rock artists versus hip-hop artists, and how much jewelry they wear on the cover of, say, the Rolling Stone, and you might find something interesting about that. That's not what we're doing for this assignment, but that's just an example of how you can use quantitative coding. We will also see an example of this when we cover the Oware article. Finally, there's the qualitative coding phase, and this is the theme identification phase. I find that this is probably the least intuitive for students when they first start doing content analysis, but I can promise you that the themes, you will find themes in your dataset once you become familiar with it. So, right, these might be things like, oh, well, this is a verse about falling in love, and this is a verse about falling out of love. Those are, themes that you can identify. So yeah, so that's just kind of the general kind of ways in which content analysis helps you to develop an understanding of your data set and then pick it apart. We will get more into kind of going from after you've picked apart your data and you're like, oh, okay, so this song has this many instances of this word, this one has whatever. Throughout this lecture, we'll get a sense as to how you can go from that kind of raw data as to, say, counts of terms or the representation of some sort of theme in a song. And you can go from just kind of that raw data to something that makes connections to the academic literature or the important concepts that we cover in this class. Assignment 1. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the assignment here, but please do read the detailed instructions posted on Quarkus, and feel free to reach out with any questions in the discussion section of Quarkus as well. In that way we can get a kind of collective discussion going and hopefully get your questions answered in ways which benefit everybody. Great. So the assignment is due on February 26th at the end of the day. To complete it, what you'll have to do is a gender analysis of hip-hop lyrics. So again, throughout this lecture, we're going to be talking about ways of picking apart your data and saying things about them. When you do this analysis, you'll have to pick apart your data and say something about how gender is represented or handled in these lyrics. And you'll have to, generate some sort of thesis statement and make connections to the course readings. I would make sure that you download the supplementary readings that are for this week. So you will have to read one of those and cite it, refer to it, engage with it in your discussion in assignment 1. And hopefully by kind of skimming through the abstracts of each of those papers, you'll have a sense as to which one is most interesting to you, those sorts of analysis that you want to do for this paper. And then that way you can kind of think back and forth as to, okay, well, I'm interested in reading this supplementary paper. What songs out of these available 8 are going to help me to speak to that theme the most? So in that sense, I want you to go through the steps outlined in the assignment instructions, but I want you to go through those steps with some degree of foresight. So I want you to have a sense as to what do you hope to learn by unpacking these lyrics? What's the kind of guiding question that you have based on your reading of the course materials and maybe the thing that attracted you about the abstract for one of those supplementary readings. So kind of hold that in your mind when you're thinking about, okay, so there's 8 tracks here. Which one of them do I want to which one of them do I want to select? Consider things like, are the artists men, women? Are the themes about romantic relationships, or say familial relationships, which are pretty obvious, sometimes just from the titles or just from kind of listening to the track. So yes, I hope that you approach the assignment in that fashion. I think that will really pay off. That will really differentiate basically, like the C, B papers from the A papers. Before moving away from this assignment, I guess, just wanted to say the title of the assignment, Check the Rhyme, is just a reference to a Tribe Called Quest track, and that's why it's spelled that way. So let's get into the readings for this week. The first reading brings us all the way back to 1903, when Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk was published. I assume that you're already familiar with Du Bois's work, as usually gets covered in classic sociological theory courses, because he, in this book, in the passages that you're usually assigned, he advances the concept of double consciousness. So I assume you're already familiar with this concept because it's covered in the theory classes of earlier years. But just to give, I guess, a brief overview, Du Bois describes this idea of double consciousness as the sense of always looking at yourself through the eyes of others. And he says this as measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. So we'll get more into the relevance of the concept of double consciousness for analyzing hip-hop lyrics when we move towards the second assigned reading for today. But I just wanted to bring that up. And so, yeah, if you're not familiar with his concept of double consciousness, I would suggest to brush up on that, because that's going to be relevant going forward. In this book, I would really suggest to get yourself a copy if you are a sociology major, just because it is such a classic and is just full of insight. Each of the chapters starts off with a song, and then by the time the chapter that was assigned for this week, he starts to analyze those songs. So what he does after collecting these 10 songs that he wants to analyze, he says, of all the 10 songs, the music is distinctly sorrowful, and the songs tell in the word and music of trouble and exile, of strife and hiding. They grope towards some unseen power. So he draws a connection between all 10 of these songs and says that and calls them, the sorrow songs. I don't expect you to do such a powerful analysis of music or to present your analysis in such a beautiful and poetic way, but I did want to assign this reading because Du Bois really I think he presents the first sociological analysis of music and lyrics here, especially. And if that's not the case, he's definitely the first one to do that and connect it to the relevance of race for social life. So that's kind of why I wanted to bring this up, and I hope that in reading this you did see some of the beauty of Du Bois's writing, and get a sense as to the historical legacy of African American slavery, and specifically the musical legacy. He gestures towards this on, I believe it's page 123, but at the time of his writing, rock and roll wasn't a thing. And, we're not going to get into that in this class, but in the history of rock and roll can kind of be drawn back to the blues, which is another predominantly African American form of expression, which is itself rooted in the musical legacy of African American slavery. But all those points aside, the main sort of takeaway from this chapter, aside from just being able to see these connections, is understanding what's Du Bois's method of lyrical analysis. I don't think it's as clear as it could be. You know, back in the days of classical sociological work, we didn't have the same sort of formalized introduction, lit review methods, findings, discussion, conclusion sort of approach to writing research articles and chapters. So hopefully this will help you to kind of pick apart what it is that he's doing, how he's seeing lyrics, and why they're important. So the first thing is he sees lyrics as these intergenerational messages. So he sees it as ways of earlier generations passing down their wisdom and their stories to later generations. He conveys this, I feel, really powerfully early on in the chapter, where he presents it and presents the music. If any of you musicians out there do want to take a shot at playing and singing the songs that he presents here, I would that would be very cool. But sorry, I got distracted by that because that would be amazing. But yeah, so he was saying that music is a way of communicating across the generations, and that's a very powerful thing in that way. This isn't new. When we think back to the way that parables and stories and early, things were communicated in early histories through bards and whatever, music has always kind of played that role, but he's showing it how it plays a specific role in the intergenerational trajectory of African Americans, which is important. Second, he sees lyrics as inner thoughts. So if we connect this back to that idea of double consciousness, he's saying that these lyrics don't represent, the dominant culture consciousness, the white consciousness. This represents the true kind of inner consciousness of black folk, which is often distorted because of this double consciousness thing. Lastly, and I don't expect you to do this because I feel like this is a very kind of nuanced and expert way of approaching lyrical analysis. If there is something like this that you notice throughout your analysis in assignment 1 or assignment 2, feel free to do it, although this is kind of above and beyond. But what he does too is also identify omissions and silences. He says there's many of these characters mentioned, but there's none of these, or they're often missing. And I believe that was in the sense of there was a lot of mentions of mothers, sisters, and brothers, but very little mentions of fathers in these songs. And so he says that that's very telling as to the history and cultural context of African Americans. Alright, so jumping from something published in 1903 to something that was published last year, we see how Allen and Randolph are building on Du Bois's concept of double consciousness and his idea of using lyrics to analyze and understand the kind of inner worlds of African Americans. To do this, these authors advance the concept of interiority, building on that concept of quiet. Just a quick aside here, throughout this class, I know that Allen and Randolph are referring to Cashier, I believe it is, who advanced this concept of quiet. Although when you're using this concept on the assignments or on the assessments, you can just refer to Allen and Randolph, and that wouldn't be considered plagiarism or anything. So I just wanted to say that. Alright, so moving towards some more recent writing, we have Allen and Randolph's lyrical analysis, where they advance this concept of interiority. So interiority, or quiet, is the aspect of hip-hop lyrics where you can identify the inner life of hip-hop artists. So I think that this is important to identify because, thinking back to last week, rarely, if ever, was there a nuanced understanding of the context, the identity of the artist that they were criticizing. So, when analyzing 61 songs across these four albums, Allen and Randolph identify three ways of finding interiority or quiet in hip hop lyrics. I think these are worth noting and taking a look at in the article if you hadn't already taken a close look at these, because these are definitely codes that you can use when you're completing assignment one. So, ways of identifying interiority they describe as self-talk. So this could be like a kind of inner monologue presented to the audience on the album. Personal advice, this could be, they describe this as something that was like hard won, sort of like advice that helps the artists navigate life, right? And then the last thing is hidden thoughts and feelings. So these are things that the artist admits to maybe not being super forthcoming about, or maybe there's some means of like trying to hide it, but it coming out nonetheless throughout the song, or something like that. So yeah, I would suggest to think about these codes as you go through assignment one and consider what that means for the interiority of the artist who's expressing them. It might be worth noting just kind of maybe one point of critique in this article. I think they do a pretty good job of addressing it, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it if you want to bring this up in the discussion this week. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on whether Allen and Randolph overemphasize the private nature of rap lyrics. As we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, a common theme in analysis is analysis of hip-hop music is to kind of underemphasize that the context of this music, these songs being created in the context of like a cultural industry. Trisha Rose touches on this in the reading for the Hip Hop Wars week. But yeah, so do you think that these do really represent the inner thoughts of the hip hop artist, or do you think that there's some sort of editing that's going on which might partially undercut Allen and Randolph's point here? Again, I do feel like they address this pretty well in the article, though I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. The final reading we'll cover today is Oware's The Man's Woman content analysis. He looked at 44 songs, like chart-topping songs by women rappers, and did line-by-line quantitative coding. So this is something that you can do, especially in the kind of like open coding phase. You can just go through each line and provide a description of it. Doesn't have to be perfect the first time you go through. Often kind of going through that process will help to reveal the themes that you'll ultimately use, and then you can go through it again to identify like the ones that you're ultimately going to use. Again, you can borrow from the author here, so let's just get a bit more into what he did. So he did a quantitative content analysis. He counted every line that included, overconfidence. He called this exaggerated braggadocio, which is a bit of a technical term, but feel free to use it on your assignment. The use of alcohol and drugs. This was mentioned in the previous paper when the authors were talking about how these hip-hop artists kind of carve out this inner world in ways which might not be super healthy, and then instances of dissing other artists. You can see all of his codes here and how many counts he had at the later half of the paper. But so in making these counts, he was showing that typically masculine and aggressive tendencies of hip-hop music, like that bragging, aggressive bragging and dissing other artists, would co-occur with the more emancipatory messages of women hip-hop artists, which would be to say challenge gender norms or push back against the normalcy of men on of domestic violence, things like that. And so, however, by counting the instances of these two things, Oware shows that Oware shows that they tend to co-occur, and by co-occurring, the emancipatory messages expressed in these songs are canceled out. Okay, so I want to go through an example of his analysis because I feel like he provides one which will help you to kind of see what you need to do on the assignment. So on page 794, he pulls up this lyric here. So he talks about this hip-hop artist who's reversing the typical gender roles, right? So he quotes this lyric here, which, in which the artist asks, or she says, let's have drinks at the bar and I'll buy the drinks, basically. And then when he's analyzing this, this is the part where, you would present a chunk of lyrics too, and you would present your own kind of analysis of what's going on in terms of the gender relationships, right? This is the goal of the assignment, is to talk about gender by drawing on these lyrics. After Oware presents these lyrics, he writes, men are typically thought to be the initiators in heterosexual relationships. She demonstrates agency in the situation, upending the normative male-female courtship ritual whereby men approach women and buy them drinks. So this is the kind of analysis that you should be shooting towards. How are the artists constructing gender relations, and how are they acting towards them? So in this sense, the artist is reacting towards this heteronormative convention of men taking the lead in relationships, and that's the context, and you can see that she's kind of like resisting this. So that's a strong point of analysis in Oware's article, and I think that it's worth noting because that's the kind of thing you should be aiming to do in assignment 1. I want to return to his major kind of thesis in the article, which is that the empowering feminist messages that he identifies or finds in these hip-hop lyrics are canceled out when they're presented alongside hypersexualized imagery of women, as well as disparaging claims about other women in their raps. So I'm curious to hear whether you agree with him on this point or not. I do think that this links back to what we were kind of talking about with Morgan last week in the critique that I presented in lecture, which is that this is kind of putting more, like a bigger burden on the people who are already oppressed. Like, do you think that Oware maybe is putting too much blame on women for disempowering themselves? Like, do you think it's reasonable for the black women that he's talking about to empower themselves single-handedly? So yeah, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Feel free to share in the discussion thread for this week. Alright, so in wrapping up today's lecture, I just want to reiterate and summarize some of the advice I've been giving about completing assignment 1. So the first piece of advice would be to begin by line coding. So that means coming up with a code or a way of describing each and every line of your data set. So this might feel weird at first, and you might just start with codes that are like, this is meaningless. Say, you're coding Gangsta's Paradise, and it's like hip to the hop to hip tip to hop, and it's like, okay, this is, just gibberish. Maybe you'll code it as gibberish, but maybe by the time you finish going through all of the lyrics that you're coding, you're like, oh, these sorts of lyrics help to maintain the party vibe of the song. So instead of gibberish, you might cross that out now and say party vibe, something like that. This is just I know that it's daunting to start coding, but I can tell you that by the time you get to the end, you'll have ideas about the lines that were first confusing to you. At that point, you can move on to considering the quantitative codes that you want to use in your analysis. What are the things that you want to count? Is there something that appears a lot, a certain term? Is there a certain theme that appears a lot? Think of it back to the Oware article where he counted instances of braggadocio, right? So this was each and every line where somebody was expressing some sort overconfidence or bragging or something like that, or it could be even dissing other people. That would be included as, one count towards this. So think about that. Then you can think about more thematic codes, more general codes. So, and these are the qualitative codes that I was discussing. So these can be at the level of a single line. So it's like, okay, this is a line where they diss somebody. This might be a verse, it might be a diss verse, it might be a diss song. You might want to code the songs at various levels like that to see if there's any interesting kind of comparisons that you can draw there. Or you can, code the verses being like, oh, okay, so this is this artist's verse, this is this other artist's verse. Maybe there's something interesting about how many artists appear on the song. And then at that point, once you've kind of picked apart all of your data, what you need to do is start drawing comparisons. So it's like, okay, I noticed that I have things that are coded as romantic relationships, so people talking about romance. Maybe there's an interesting comparison you can draw between the ways that men and women write about romance in their raps, or other things like that. There's many other points of comparison that you can draw, and you can feel free to be creative with these. Sometimes that yields the most interesting insights. Again, I want to reiterate that you can do the coding just on paper with like by hand and with markers. You can feel free to use like Word. That way you can do like Control F to do the quantitative, like identifying things that might be interesting for quantitative coding. But if you're feeling brave, or if you have some familiarity with it, you can use one of the free licenses to NVivo, which are available through the U of T website. I've included a link to that. That can help to do a lot of the work for you and to collect all of the lyrics in one spot and do all the analysis there. So yeah, if you're interested in hearing more about that, feel free to get in touch, or take a look at the like tutorial videos on YouTube and stuff. They're pretty comprehensive, but for this assignment, I think that you can manage it through Word or just on paper. Okay, great. Well, that is the material I would like to cover for our third lecture. I wish you well completing the assignment. Please, again, feel free to post your questions to the discussion thread. And I will see you after reading week.